Well, welcome to a new episode of The Art Business. Today's episode is about how curators build meaning and build careers outside the institutions that trained them. My guest works at the intersection of art, philosophy, and what she calls the relations between the human and the non-human. Questions of language, identity, gender, and increasingly the agency of animals themselves. So I'm joined by Maria Hinel, an independent curator and writer based in London. She trained at UCL and the Courtauld, cut her teeth at Skarstedt Gallery, a commercial art gallery in Mayfair, and has spent the past few years building an independent curatorial practice across spaces including General Assembly, Shtager and Shch, I hope I pronounced that right, and Hypha Studios. Maria's most recent exhibition, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, which resounds with me as a lover of the poet Blake, just closed at Hypha Gallery 1 in the City of London. It's a show that asks what it would mean to take animal resistance seriously as a form of politics. Actually, I've just finished reading Animal Farm, so I'm very into that. I myself, just to kind of submit this, I don't know about Maria, maybe we could talk about that. I've been a vegetarian for many years and pescatarian really, and I'm thinking increasingly of becoming vegan. But we might talk about whether this interest in the animal world, the human world, is part of your own philosophy later. Mm-hmm. So Maria, welcome to the Art Business.
Thank you.
So you started out on the commercial side, as I've said, and writing and editing exhibitions at Skarstedt. And in fact, that's where we met. You invited me to bring some students down to one of the shows. So what made you want to step outside of that commercial gallery world into independent curating?
Thank you, David, for having me on the podcast.
You're very welcome.
It's always a pleasure to see you in the shows and introduce the exhibitions to students. The experience at Skarstedt was invaluable and instrumental. I think the great part about my role there was the breadth of it. So I was doing exhibitions, a lot of writing, press, worked on catalogs, which created, but through its breadth, enabled me to actually see what I like to pursue. And that I realized that working on an idea and evolving it gives me a great amount of energy. And I wanted to actually at some point step out of a specific context, and rather than beginning with a set program, begin with an idea per se, and or look at artists outside of the program of a specific gallery. And that gradually sort of led me to taking that step outside, and initially staging several shows, and then recently getting opportunities to develop a more coherent set of themes across the exhibitions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think certainly the model for a commercial gallery is obviously to have either a group show or a single artist show, and focus on the artist, focus on sort of getting people into the gallery. They are, as we all know, curated very often by people with an art history, curatorial training. So there's a kind of slight mirror, I think, of the way you might curate in a not-for-profit gallery. But they tend to focus on, it's a bit like a blockbuster exhibition at Tate, focusing on a single artist. And it seems to me that you would prefer starting with a curatorial idea, say a philosophical idea, and then bringing in artists that you think would be able to work on that on your own kind of like idea. And that isn't that model probably wouldn't usually work if it were a commercial show.
I think for me, it's sort of a concurrent process of continuing conversations with artists over time and looking at the ways in which their work evolves over time. Concurrently, finding those specific angles at looking at things that hopefully might entice people to revise their views on things. And then at some point, those two strands of work, they converge and the exhibition comes to life. So I think it's sort of a very dialogic process in that way. So I don't sort of look for works that fit into specific ideas. Sometimes it's really looking very closely at the work and having really interesting conversations with artists that leads to the inflection of my thinking about certain idea.
So it's a two-way process. It's a symbiotic process
Exactly.
between you and the artist. And we'll probably talk later about why you choose certain artists, how you approach them, and then what kind of dialogue. But it does sound as though you're giving the artist a lot of license to work on a theme. And I guess that's a kind of curatorial idea that has got a history. A lot of in my world where I'm taking people to more commercial galleries most of the time, the big historical ones, if you meet a curator gallerist who's been working there for several decades, and they've often produced artists that are really well known now, they will nearly always say what you've just said, that this is actually, it's a kind of relationship. It's not just me thinking, oh, this artist is going to make me money. I mean, maybe that's a kind of added plus, obviously, but generally speaking, they're very sincere people who have developed like a relationship and have grown with the artist over the years. But personally, I think that's the best model, be it not for profit or for profit anyway. So independent curating is a very different economic proposition to working inside a gallery. So what was the moment you decided to make that leap? And what did the first year or two of building as an independent practice actually look like, both practically for you and maybe even financially?
I think it was a gradual process of realizing that it's sort of time to maybe transition into a more independent way of working. And of course, you know, it was a great program to work with and through at the gallery, and sort of being there allowed me to really meet some great people, journalists, curators, gallerists, and eventually that led to some of the opportunities outside of Skarstedt that came up, and people invited me to do a project and then another, and then sort of that was a sort of a trigger, I suppose, to doing it. So there's like always for something to happen, I think there's always long-term reasons that build up, and then there's a small thing that occurs, and then you just realize that that's the right time. So I think that was one of those cases in a way.
Sort of a catalytic moment.
Exactly.
But what you're saying, what you're describing, Maria, you hear so often in the art world, and not so much in other worlds. There's a lot of serendipity involved. It's very networked. The kind of theoretical texts are usually written by sociologists on the way that this commercial art world, but also its interface with the not-for-profit art world, the way it works. And it's all, I always imagine constellations, basically, with some big obvious stars in constellations, but a lot of stars that we can't yet see, and occasional black holes, I'm afraid. But I also think it's a bit like, contemporary theories of what's happening in the universe, that we're expanding, all of that stuff. I always think that is a really good analogy for what's happening in the art world. I'm just going to switch this panel. That's it. And if we get hot. Yeah. By the way, for listeners around the world, we're still in we wouldn't call it a heat wave anymore, but I think it's going to return next week to London. But we're in a kind of listed building. It's in Bedford Square, the Sotheby's Institute of Art building where I work. And we're in the basement, luckily, where it's not too warm. But later in the day, it can get warm. Anyway, so your practice is often described as sitting at the intersection of art and philosophy, as I've already said, with a recurring interest in the human and non-human, in linguistics, and in identity and gender. So how did that particular constellation of interests come together? Is there a single thread that connects a show about time, one of your shows, a show about carbon, which I attended with some students, and a show about animal resistance, which I'm afraid I never got to. It was so busy in the summer. But, how is there a thread that connects all those things? Maybe you could talk about the way they started, the way they evolved, those shows.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the core of many of those shows was the question about the way humanity positions itself to the rest of the world. I think if we think about kind of how our political systems are set up, our legal systems, our language even is set up, it's runs on this assumption that people sit outside of the natural world, particularly of of how the earth runs, of how ecology operates. And I I found myself increasingly looking for angles to challenge that and show that it's contingent and it's arbitrary in a way, and it's sort of been formed through centuries of specific types of thinking. And in that sense, suddenly all of the shows you listed sort of sought to question those boundaries in different ways. I mean, the exhibition about time, it was called Timescapes, and it looked at the perception of time and how we in this moment navigate temporality and the prevalence of clock time, and the fact that now it seems so universal, but actually it was something that was introduced fairly recently. And even before sort of mid-19th century, there was not a specific confirmed clock time across different cities, even, let alone
the British Empire got its hands on.
Exactly. And it's such a political subject too, because of course, when the Greenwich Observatory was built, there were certain sort of, I guess, anarchist organizations who tried to blow it up because it was seen as a gesture of political domination, having a single time scale imposed on the world. And on the other side of the spectrum is, the tidal rhythms and the sun rhythms and the way actually our bodies are built to attune themselves to those things. And we are now completely shutting ourselves off it. And that was working with a number of artists who sort of tried to reinstate that connection with, with the earth time, the long term view of the accrual of the land, or of the daytime and the nighttime, the kind of the cadence of that. So, for example, Yelena Popova is a really interesting artist who, I think her work is very focused on ecology, both in its subject matter, but also in the materials, because she doesn't use any materials derived from artificial substances. And the series that I had in the exhibition was actually her soil paintings, where she looks for samples of soil from specific parts of the UK, sometimes where she is based, so something that relates to her personally, and then uses that as a material to build those very beautiful compositions that look like that threshold between sea and land, I guess, to me, this sort of like dynamic. And there is, so yeah, that this idea of time, I think, has always been really interesting to me. And, likewise, I also did a show about humor, and actually, to me, humor is also relevant to that, because we don't always, not taking oneself too seriously as a species, I think relates back to that question. And I think another thing that really interests me is language, how we use language. So this show called The Middle Voice was something I've been reading about this, that the fact that some languages don't have, how in English, for instance, there's active voice and passive voice. So in some languages, there are more voices.
Mm-hmm.
In Greek, I think there's
the octative. I did it at university. The subjunctive,
right? Yeah. So including the middle voice, which not only existed in Greek and ancient Greek, but also in some kind of other forms of ancient languages. And I was really interested in this dichotomy of active passive, and how humans really constantly see themselves as agents in an inert world. Nothing else has agency apart from humanity, according to some of the conventional maybe modes of looking at things. And I was sort of inviting people to imagine what it's like to use language differently, and imagine or acknowledging matter to have that agency.
No, absolutely. And before clocks, we all know that we had to navigate by the stars and by the sun and by the moon and by the tides. And obviously all ancient mythologies and cultures are they turn them into gods, obviously, but basically all of those gods are based on non-human elements of the world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
Funnily enough, a very close friend the other day said to me, stopped and looked at me and said, I really think that we are alien, the human race wasn't always here. I think we're aliens from another world because we just don't fit into this world. The world seems to be getting on very nicely without us. I thought that was a nice way of putting it.
Mm-hmm. I was reading an account of someone who was living on their own at sea, just on a boat, and it sort of really shifts, arguably, their perspective on their place in the world.
Absolutely.
Because you have to really listen to things around you, and anticipate it and sort of negotiate it.
Yeah. No, and I mean that sea theme. I've just seen Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, which is obviously based on ancient Greek, very well-known ancient Greek text. Apparently, all the books are sold out now, so it's quite good for my interests, which are in that classical world. But that one of the themes running through Nolan's film is a very strong thing about not just nature, but particularly the sea, because obviously Odysseus and his companions are usually the monsters that arrive very close to the sea or they're in the sea. And that got me thinking also about what this kind of post-humanist, we might call it, philosophy that you're following along with some others. I found it really fascinating. And obviously it fits very much into the way we should be thinking about our place in the world today. But there's a lot of people out there we still have to convince. And then moving on to the carbon thing that I do remember being really fascinating and thought-provoking. I'd still think about that show and the artists in it and the way you were curating it. But maybe you could talk about carbon and things behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the show I co-curated with Indira Dusubay, and she's also an independent curator. And that particular exhibition started off as taking as a point of departure a specific text by Primo Levi, who's really interesting writer that I've been kind of thinking about for a long time. That text really stayed with me, and essentially it was called Carbon, and he was a chemist, Primo Levi, as well as a writer, and it traced a specific particle of carbon, really highlighting its incredible capacity and propensity to change states, and it's a very highly binding element, which is arguably one of the key factors behind the fact that we have life. And the fluidity of one particle, going from organic into inorganic, from animals to plants to humans, and eventually in the text it ends up in his glass of milk, and he drinks it, and he says it goes into my brain and makes me write this dot right here. So it's sort of also the relationship with text and writing, and carbon is a particle with a dot. It's all very both grounded in the real, but it's also highly poetic. I think that was really fascinating starting point. And I think for an exhibition that was co-curated, that was also quite a fruitful ground for us, because it brought out different interests that each of us had in the project, all cited different themes. I mean, of course, we narrowed it down and to build an exhibition that reads cohesively. But I think for me, that in many ways came back to this idea of how personal everything we do in the world becomes, because if we change the environment and the carbon with all the carbon emissions, with everything, with all the imbalances that we create outside, the same comes back to being inside the body. And I guess this question of making something inherent to one's identity perhaps might drive some more response from the audiences. That was my question. I was interested in, might it do that? And there are many artists in the show that directly and indirectly reflected on that. I mean, for example, Amy Parrott, the artist I think is incredibly interesting. And the second project I did with her, and her works. So she uses a essentially monotype technique. So she paints on the plate and then presses it onto a very thin calico fabric that sort of takes up from the plate, and it sort of seeps in, and the image is sort of rendered through the reception as much as from it sort of opens up through this it creates a skin-like membrane almost. And
I remember them.
Yeah.
It's stunning, and it sends shivers down your spine when you. It's just so delicate as well, but you can almost see your kind of carbon idea at work. Transmogrification, is that the right word? Transmogrification of one material into another, and the way the material accepts it. But there's human agency, obviously, in the artists doing that. But I remember a lot of that show was about human agency, but also about now I've done it's like setting up an experiment involving physics, and there was the one with the cosmic rays.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Maybe you could explain that, because that was fascinating. I remember my students finding that really particularly fascinating, because they'd never seen it before.
Yes, this is Susan Eyre. It's actually also an artist I worked with several times. She was also included in the recent show about animals, and she has a very interesting practice. Broadly, she's interested in kind of invisible forces that constantly surround us, and the cosmic rays in particular. That was a highly. It's a video that sort of built its own sensory kind of landscape, because it was you didn't necessarily. It was not didactic in any way. It didn't explain what is unfolding from the physics standpoint, but it sort of sought to make visible those processes in a more sensorial way and make one become aware a little bit more, of attend to those things, which I thought was really powerful. I mean, broadly speaking, she was interested in the kind of the traveling carbon particles from many aeons away, and they penetrate the atmosphere at speed, constantly landing in our environment. And of course, that's it really. And then she did the cloud chamber demonstration.
That's what we saw. Yeah, it's remarkable.
Because I mean, the cloud chamber is in fact a physics experiment.
Yes, yes. It's, I think, probably the Science Museum has sometimes shown this.
But she used the cloud chamber to film that work.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so they're directly related.
Yes, yes.
And essentially, we all witnessed those carbon particles that probably saw completely different galaxies recently.
It's incredible. I mean, I mean, that's an example of how art that kind of art you're interested in. I mean, I regularly now think of these particles that none of us can see, sort of just zooming through our bodies.
Yes.
Zooming through every matter. and it then reminds you of, the color spectrum and the colors that we don't see. We again, coming back to that human thing, we see a very narrow part of everything as well through our senses. I mean, even Plato agreed that all of our senses are corrupted. They corrupt everything we sense and smell and see and feel. I love that. And Plato was trying to get back to an ideal where we would go back to this kind of other worlds that our senses just can't see. And obviously that affected his ideas on art as well.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, how work for the animals exhibition was also centered on this thing that what we as a species can't see and what other species can see. The work was about birds who navigate using magnetic vision.
Yes.
And birds, of course, they know where the north is. And
I've always had some pet dogs. I've always had border collies that are very sensitive, very intelligent sheepdogs, and they will sense. I remember once the dog was just sitting bolt upright on a beach in Devon, and just wouldn't come. And about an hour later, there was this incredible thunderstorm, where the news the next day, it was in the national news that people were drowning and pets were being taken up by helicopter. It was an incredible event, but it was on the other side of the peninsula, but she sensed it, obviously. So that's an example of that. Animals so often They have this other sense, what we might call a sixth sense, that only a few human beings maybe purport to have, but they definitely have it.
Yeah, we need to learn from them.
Absolutely. But, well, you learn by they're trying to tell you something. Don't go any further on the beach, get back to safety, basically. And suddenly you saw these kind of thunderclouds coming over, but she was a prophet. So you've talked a little bit about a couple of the artists that you work with. So the question is, how do you some curators build a practice around artists or sometimes mediums. I remember the RA once had a show called Bronze, and they obviously brought in lots of works of art from different periods, different cultures using that material. But you seem to build yours obviously around ideas. So how do you go about finding the artists whose work can actually carry on your own philosophical question rather than just illustrate it? So it would be very easy, for example, to say, I mean, my students have a project like this. We give them a fictional benefactor. There's a choice of 4. And they have to buy 12 works of art from the real art market, but they have to base the works of art they choose and curate them and catalogue them and display them around a theme which reflects that benefactor's sometimes philosophical interests. So they're kind of doing it backwards. But are you just looking for works of art that already exist, or do these artists sometimes respond to your philosophical idea?
Well, I think, it's a very two-way process as well. And especially with a number of artists, like I said, I've known them for some time now, which creates a more like a dialogue that enables us to find an angle to a specific idea that resonates in their practice. Sometimes there are specific works that I'm really interested in, including some historical works that I think really add an important dimension to the show. For example, for the animals show, I thought that there's a specific, relatively early video by Francis Alÿs that is called El Gringo, and it sort of is shot from a hip. So it's by Francis and Rafael Ortega, who's an incredible artist, filmmaker as well, and they've been working together for a long time. And it looks at the dog's perspective, the stray dogs in streets in Mexico, and sort of the dogs eventually get very territorial, and it's both threatening and humorous in different ways. And it obviously looks at this idea of surveillance broadly, and also the urban environments and how animals are often displaced from urban environments. But also, I thought, for the purposes of my exhibition, which I guess we'll turn a bit later, I was also creating that sort of presence for an animal, taking back control of their space, and also kind of creating a mildly threatening space for a human being in that context, which I thought was a really fascinating element. And that's why I was lucky enough to be able to include that work. But likewise, many artists did completely new pieces, either responding to the building or the context, the theme. Yeah, so it's sort of both take place.
And that brings us on, I think, to the next question very nicely. I mean, I was immediately, when you were saying that, I'm immediately also thinking of the Venice Biennale, where a curator is eventually elected, and they create a poetic title, and then the Milk of Dreams comes to my mind. All the world's strangers, stranieri ovunque, strangers everywhere, and then individual nations and their artists have to riff on that kind of theme in their own ways, if you like. Obviously, that's a huge event, and then it's all about how many of your artists really say, I must see the space first? And, do you get some artists who don't really need to do that, and others who really want to see so the question was going to be, what does the ecosystem of project spaces offer a curator that a commercial gallery system, for example, doesn't? You've got your bricks and mortar building. It's always good to be in there. And what are the limits, as it were, of spaces? I mean, it sounds as though you're always interested in choosing new spaces all the time as well.
Yes. I think to your first question, most artists, unless they're based internationally, will want to see the space. And I'm all for that. I think it's really important part of planning. And in that particular context, that was the space sort of off that I got from Hypha Studios, and it was in the middle of. It was a very right opposite bank station and entrance, and a building called One Poultry, and there were 3 exhibition spaces inside this. It's a very important postmodernist landmark, which were programmed for a year. So I think that idea of temporary nature of it was a very unique aspect that made it quite interesting to some of the artists, I think, and also the context.
Prevalent of commercial galleries. A lot of curators in London now working commercially are also finding pop-up spaces and then moving on to another space.
Yeah.
Because that's obviously just to do with politics and the economy. It's just so expensive having your own space now. In fact, recently I did a podcast with a couple of people who have decided to move out of that world and just curate shows in their own home. I went to one the other night. And it's quite interesting. It's a bit like a return to the French salon. So they bring musicians in, poets, opera singers, and they have the art in their home surroundings. But it's all looking very beautiful, but it's also for sale. But yes. Yeah, sorry that I interrupted your flow of thought there. So spaces.
I think just it's interesting that it was very far from a domestic space in a way that was in a very busy part of London, and it was sort of ground floor looking out on one of the busiest roads, and that meant that the flow of people was quite diverse. There were a lot of children, many people who work there, who traveled to London, as well as obviously people who wanted to see the show specifically, but that also created some of the most serendipitous encounters. And it was also interesting to see people who go there every day to work, kind of engaging with it and attending a lot of programming. So in a project space, I think it's really important to have a diverse, with available resources, of course, to have a very diverse program that sort of invites families and sort of finds a way to talk about themes in the show in a very accessible way. And
were you aware of that? As a curator, I think I would be very aware. I mean, certainly commercial galleries, as you know, they'll put something stunning in the window because they want people to stop and look and then come in. I mean, were you aware of that in that space opposite Bank Station? Or is that not? Is that a little bit too commercial, and it's not you're more inward, and you don't really want to kind of put something spectacular in the window? I don't know how are you thinking about that?
Yes. So there were actually window spaces, and I used them there were 2. So I used them in 2 different ways. The one hand, I had a very stunning work by Adamczymek Davadosh, who's a Mongolian, really interesting artist based in Paris. And on the other hand, it was a kind of a push and pull, I think, idea a little bit, or maybe it was, I can't say. Yeah, I was kind of interested in this idea of bringing people in, but also giving presence to animal agency. So on the other hand, it was shall I wait until?
It's okay. Just ignore it. Just test this. It's okay. We can carry on. It's working space.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the window had a part of the installation by Amalia Pica and Rafael Ortega, which is a really interesting work, multi-channel installation. The main channel was installed in a separate room where there was beautiful projection of chimpanzees in the natural reserve who look straight into the camera, and they installed a trap cam, and there was a moment where the family of chimpanzees, they found it and they kind of very consciously engage with it, and it's an incredible moment, them realizing that they're the observed and really sort of collectively looking at each other and kind of questioning what is that object. But what some of the audiences didn't immediately maybe realize. And then that the fact that they installed another trap cam just like it in the room, which was filming the visitors. And that footage was being projected on several screens in the space, including the outside vitrine. So you had a lot of people kind of in CCTV camera.
Did you have to warn people that they might be on?
Well,
this seems to be a legal issue, but that's maybe in the art context, everyone got it.
Well, actually, that footage that we ended up using was not live. It was from another iteration of that project. But yeah, it's a very interesting question, right? Because
the whole thing about surveillance,
right? But also the fact that animals never gave their permission to be filmed.
Absolutely.
And how we
we think we can just do that
without
asking permission.
We can research them, right? We can kind of
for
our own benefit. And it sort of questions the legal status of animals once again that they don't have yet, unfortunately.
Absolutely. So your most recent shows staged, as we've already said, this spring in Hypha Gallery, one at number 1 Poultry, right in the middle of the city of London's financially. So it took its title from Olga Tokarczuk's novel. Is that the right pronunciation?
I think it's Tokarczuk, but I mean,
Tokarczuk. Okay.
I'm not sure actually.
Which in turn borrows a line from William Blake, "Drive your plow," and plow significantly archaically spelt P-L-O-W, which I love. Drive your plow over the bones of the dead. What a title. So what was it about that title and that lineage, Blake to Tokarczuk, to the exhibition, that made it the right frame for the show, that title? Because I always think titles are really, really important for works of when so much art in the past, of course, was never given a title. We impose titles on them. And I've written about that, how that can be incorrect. It can force an incorrect or only partly correct reading of an old master, as we might call them in the trade. But titles have become more and more important, of course, with some artists. So the title of the show, how did you get to that and then from that?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about the title for the exhibition for a long time, and that incredible quotation from Blake that Tokarczuk's used for the title of the novel, in the end, I felt it's a quote from the Proverbs of Hell, so one of the opening sentences there. And I felt, first of all, sort of the idea, the word drive is incredibly active, and it sort of spurs some allusions to activism.
Human agency again.
But yeah, or sort of.
But yeah, intervention politically, all sorts of interventions. Yeah.
Yes, but also the bones of the dead. There's so many directions it goes. Yes, sort of the history, the ancestry, but also the loss of life. The constant.
I was going to say, it reminds us that there are very recent massacres where people have been quickly buried, and it's not just historical archaeology and respect for the dead there that become ethically questioned. It's all the time, I guess. And by the bones of the dead, presumably the implication in Blake, I think, is not animals, it's human beings again.
Yes, I think there are many different interpretations of Blake, of course. I think for Tokarczuk, in her novel, her references to Blake are really interesting, the way she uses his texts. So first of all, this sort of the novel itself, I mean, I'm sure many people are familiar with it, but for those who are not, it's stages. So it looks at this leading character called Alina, who lives in a very remote village close in Poland, close to the border with Czech Republic. And it's a very beautiful ancient forest. And there are many animals living there, and people who live in that village are hunters. And she is a kind of retired former engineer who moved to live in that environment, and she's constantly suffering from witnessing that sort of senseless cruelty that is is justified by tradition, the fact that people have always hunted.
It's the same here.
Yeah, and
in Spain.
Yes. She is an amateur translator of Blake. So that's one of the ways in which Blake transpires in the book. And what I also found really beautiful is the way she prefaces each chapter with couplets from his writings, including the series of couplets from the Auguries of Innocence. And there's a whole section in that probably one of the most famous poem by Blake that actually prefigures some of the ideas in animal rights movement. It sort of says things like the dogs that starved at the master's gate predicts the ruin of the state, or he herds the little wren shall never be beloved by men. So and the idea of the augury, it's like a prophecy, seeing the great outcome from small things. I mean, that's why it begins, I guess, probably with the saying that, to see the world in a grain of sand. That's a very
so many ideas I can see that
beautiful idea.
Yeah, in your practice, yeah.
And
of course, the really famous Blake poems that a lot of composers, including contemporary, have set to music, things like The Lamb, Little Lamb Who Made You, it's so, and Tiger, it's, yeah. Never really thought of it that Blake as the animals. So that's a really interesting theme to bring out as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you can look at a lot of those images metaphorically, but in the auguries,
Lamb of God, yeah.
But in the auguries, I think it's harder to do so. They are much more enigmatic images.
Yeah.
And anyway, so they're brilliantly used in the novel, and the novel itself is so powerful because it really is staging many moral dilemmas and questions. I think for me, I thought what was one of the things that really stood out to me was the fact that what happens when you treat animals as persons, because they have personhood, and therefore if they have equal kind of status as a person, how does that suddenly shift our moral intuition for what is just in the treatment of animals and humans? Because following that character who is so deeply passionate, we sort of begin to feel compassion for her and also for animals she's trying to protect.
In Nolan's Odyssey film, if you see it, I would recommend it. There's this amazing episode with Circe, who's a witch, basically, and a sorceress, and it's incredible. She turns Odysseus gets parted from his crew, and they're going as usual into inland to find food and water, and they don't know what they're going to find. They find this woman, and she seems very, innocent and wants to help them. And she says, "Oh, I'll make you some food," because in Greece you do that. The strange guests, you always give food and water and a bath. And when they're eating, she gives them a drug, and they turn into animals. They turn into pigs. It's a famous story, but I'm just thinking about that as well. That I'm sure that Nolan took that episode because he was very selective. It had to be for kind of similar reasons, really. Like what happens when we turn into pigs. And then Odysseus comes in and she says, "Oh, you can slaughter your own pig." And he begins to suspect because the pigs are behaving in a strange way because they're actually his men. They've still got the soul of the man inside them. There's a lot of that in Greek mythology. Actaeon, obviously, turned into a stag. So, no, anyway, sorry, a little bit. I was just riffing off the kind of ideas that you're thinking about. And again, it made me think about slaughtering animals, which one of the reasons I became vegetarian is I thought could I actually, I remember picking up a lamb once and its heart beating, and I thought I just couldn't kill that to eat it. I wouldn't kill my dog, so quadrupeds are out. And then in order to eat a fish, I had to go and catch a fish and kill it. And I felt quite uncomfortable doing that, but that meant it kind of seemed to justify the fact that I can then eat it. Whereas so many of us, we're just going to a restaurant, we don't think about the animals, or a supermarket. Anyway, absolutely. Sorry.
I think, it maybe not. Killing something, thinking of it is probably beyond many people's thoughts, but at least I think what people should be comfortable with is watching them being killed.
Yeah.
If people every time they buy meat in the supermarket are happy to watch some scenes from slaughterhouses, then that's fine. I think
it's a philosophical justification. Apologies to people listening to this who eat meat, but it's an argument that I think that we have to discuss, and we push it under the table because, of course, so many of our friends and families do eat meat, and I have eaten meat.
Yeah, I mean, I have eaten meat when I was small, but
I was going to ask about your. Do you, in your own personal life, are you vegetarian or?
Yes. So I mean, I've never liked meat when I was small.
That was my reason. That was my main reason.
So
like it.
I think it's maybe some sort of subconscious sense, but I've always loved animals. I've always been very passionate about animals, and eventually transpired in some of those interests.
Yeah, and that's coming through in these shows. I guess we better move on. I'm aware of the time. So, but we can have a whole podcast on diets and so on. And some cultures, of course, who worship animals and won't touch them and will feed, will deliberately go around, even though they're poor. I'm just trying to think of the name of the religious sect in Asia that does that. They have philosophy. Right? Jainism, yeah, where they will actually, even though they're very poor, they will share their food with stray dogs. It's a remarkable culture. Very interesting. So how do you, I was going to ask, how do you curate around an idea like animal vengeance without it tipping into allegory, keeping it grounded in specific research lives of specific animals? We talked about that, really. So the artist list spans painting, photography, sculpture, video, and performative installations. From Jochen Lempert's quiet, almost scientific silver gelatin prints of owls and spiderwebs, beautiful, to Francis Alÿs, you've spoken about, quite well known, Amalia Pica and Marie Maes, Brindis Schneursburnsdottir, I'm sure I mispronounced that, and Mark Wilson. How did you think about pacing such a materially diverse group of works, i.e. the different materials, through that space so the argument builds rather than fragments, as you might expect it to do, because you're constantly looking at different materials? How did you find that together?
Well, when I was thinking about the selection of works for the exhibition, I realized I'm kind of interested in several factors, in one of which was the fact that I was inviting artists for whom the animal subject is probably one of the key subjects in their work, is certainly an important part of their practice. And it's sort of not like an occasional picture of a cat, So, I mean, as much as I love pictures of cat, I have a cat as well.
Yes.
But I was kind of interested in how the thinking about this topic evolves over time. And another point was, I think, the fact that the work sort of, to me, appeared to really seek animal perspective, really stepping outside the human-centric vision, and either give space to animals themselves to act. Like, for example, in the work I described about the chimpanzees, who are we're just witnessing this unedited image of chimpanzees having the agency.
Discovering the camera, suddenly.
Yeah. Or Pat Lyons is a really interesting painter based in Brooklyn. She builds those, in a way, Blakeian visions of animals. First of all, kind of presented larger than life, having that presence and power to, not be persecuted, to actually enjoy life, hopefully. And
we've got rid of most of the mammoths, and for that very reason.
Yes, and those factors, I think, were a sufficient grounding for the selection.
So it's the idea, not the material, that is connecting.
No, yeah, I think it's just the sense of this sense. I mean, it was, of course, these factors are fairly subjective, but I think they created some kind of common shared ground, some common sensibility. But it was, on the other hand, fantastic to see such a diverse group of voices and media responding to that exhibition idea. or more like underscoring and evolving this exhibition idea. And I don't necessarily deliberately have such a diverse group of media, but I think it helps to sort of, it always ends up being the case, and I think it's quite curious.
I agree. I like the variety of the shows.
Yeah, there was kind of from scent that the show featured the scent work by Marie Maes, from her series on bee agency to video to installation, and I think that sort of allows, just cognitively for the viewer, maybe creates those jumps from one medium to the other, making sure that there is sort of some tiny awakening to the idea from a new angle each time. I think that's subconsciously what I'm getting at when I'm installing the exhibition.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was going to ask, is there a feminist reading running underneath the animal rights one, a connection between how society disbelieves women, Tsitsi, and the other female characters of the Odyssey that are so interesting, and how it disbelieves animals? We disbelieve animals. We disbelieve, traditionally, patriarchies disbelieve women. Prophetesses, there's lots of stories. Cassandra was never believed, even though she told the truth.
Yes, I mean, for the novel, in which the leading character, Janina, is constantly kind of trying to be heard, being is dismissed, and she's, it specifically shows the reality of probably older women, that the sort of this set of sense of difficulty of getting one's message across. I think for me, the book also really powerfully showed the dimension around animal activists and how they are perceived. Now, yes, there are probably a greater proportion of animal activists who are women. I'm not sure this is why they are perceived the way they are perceived. I mean, the animal activists, probably not. I think there is
perception, isn't there? That it must be a feminine thing because it's kind of weak, and
I mean, I think broadly speaking, and then there are many incredible activists across all genders. So I don't want to kind of limit it in any way.
You're quite right. The perception that we think of, most people probably think of a woman if they thought of an animal activist, is what you're saying.
I think it's a fact. It seems there was some research, and that there is
a
majority. Yeah, it's just the way the animal activists are portrayed in popular culture, and generally are seen as kind of annoying, pedantic people. It's really puzzling to me. I think it's a real tremendous paradox, because for me, I think animal justice movements is probably the last social justice movement that remains sort of unaddressed, and any efforts to counter that should be appreciated on a moral level in a society, rather than sort of deemed as annoying. And
well, we all know why it's deemed as annoying, because people like eating meat and they're not going to stop. And that's the fundamental question, I always think, with animal rights. I think the UK has a better record on animal rights than a lot of European countries, for example, that I've been through and talked to local people about. You go through some countries, you never even see the animals. You don't see the chickens. Where are they? Where are they getting their eggs from, and so on, is my question. And sometimes the lack of visibility can be so interesting as well. It's sort of part of English artistic pastoralism is, of course, is seeing the cows in the Gainsborough Constable fields, isn't it? It's part of our culture, perhaps, but you don't often see that sometimes, like, visibility.
Yeah, it was a very sensitive question, and that's why I thought having that part speculative, because in a way, the book, for example, it builds the speculative vision of what happens when animals fight back. And having that speculative narrative is already incredibly satisfying, because we know that animals can have agency and do have agency. And in fact, that happens. Like, there is a lot of resistance from animals occurring on daily basis.
They will defend themselves and their children.
There are several research, the studies, there are several publications on the history of animal resistance with a lot of examples where sort of the lion will, go for a specific person who abused him.
Yeah.
And there are so many examples of escapes.
Interesting.
And
so we in documentaries, we tend to see the animal picking on the weak animal out of a herd. But you're also saying there's evidence that the animal will, if it remembers someone that was cruel to them, it will go for them first.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I think part of the thinking was, it's like a hypothesis. What if, when we see animals having that agency and acknowledging it, and in fact, anyone who's had a pet, I think, will agree that they have a personhood.
Yeah.
Having that would somehow create compassion for them, because we see that actually they have the same set. They face the same set of choices and as we do.
Yeah.
And they also want freedom, and they also want some basic rights, and
they don't like going to the vet.
No, exactly. So that was the hypothesis, and I don't know how.
Yeah, no.
If it will evolve.
I guess we've kind of strayed maybe a little bit off the. I'm also again aware of the time, so we might. I know that you're a patron of the South London Gallery and the patronage of those galleries, but we might bring that into these sort of final questions. So, because I wanted to just talk about looking ahead, you've got these two exhibitions opening at the end of the year, a solo show of Italian artist Claudia Losi at the artist-run space Corner 7 in London, and a group exhibition, The Logic of Place, actually in Belgium at the Marie Maes Gallery. What can you tell us about these, and how do they connect to the questions we've already been discussing? I mean, Claudia Losi, I had a look at some of the works, and one of them, for example, was a beautiful coloured drawing of I think it was a stag, and superimposed on its body was a wolf's head in its body, which is that binary that we've already been kind of discussing, really. But again, how did you choose Claudia's work? Those two spaces, it'd be quite interesting for you to hear about.
So Claudia is a really interesting artist I've been following for a long time, and thematically her work looks at, in part, animals, but also how historically people have mystified animals and relationship with animals before the arrival of the idea that animal is a cat, is a property that we can just it's like an asset that we eat or we get clothes from. It never used to be like that up until industrialization. I think it sort of it was. I mean, augury is the art of reading birds' movements and getting information out of that. And it's sort of, they were messengers. They were kind of some emblems of the imminent knowledge elsewhere. And Claudia, she often finds those echoes of kind of sometimes prehistoric images of animals and connects them to some of the narratives today. And in this exhibition, it will develop her project around, they sort of evolved out of workshops with children, really. So and we're going to do a series of workshops with children in Kaplan. Yes. And Corner 7 is a wonderful artist-run space.
That's right.
Run by Rose Davey. And she often stages really interesting dialogues between groups of children and artists through workshops or performances. And Claudia, she uses paper, and she kind of calls it thinking with her hands. So she tears paper incredibly quickly, and it very quickly arrives at a figure of an animal, sometimes semi-animal, semi-human. And the beauty of it is so, and then she kind of installs it in the space. It's sort of sea of figures. So sometimes they become sculptures in metal, sometimes they become drawings, tapestries. So the exhibition will bring those things together. But it's also fascinating how quickly children
can do
that and create those beautiful images as well. Another exhibition, The Logic of Place, is again looking at this the relationship between the body of the artist and the materials they're using, and sort of some of those encounters, the ways in which some of those encounters can really highlight that the tension between those two, the way that the relationship between the body and the material is not has this agency distributed away from the human, always not always fully in the human body, and sort of how the body navigates that, sort of the sense of resistance of the material. And so
I think we have a fear. I mean, when you talk to people about do you do art, and so many people say, oh no, I was never very good at that. My friends were just natural. They're just born artists, and I think we're brought up with the fear of, oh God, I can't do that. And then paradoxically at the same time, you're you get the trope situation where, oh, my child could do that. It's a kind of curious thing about art, isn't it? And I love that idea that you're going to be bringing children in now as well, because again, arguably there are parallels, I think, with the relationship between the human, implied human adult we're talking about, and the animal, and the relationship with the child as well. There's a kind of similarity there, I think, and a rights thing going on as well. What rights do we have to intrude on children's thinking and lives, and what political rights do they have? It's very similar, I think. And are those kind of ideas that are floating around your head, or do you have other ideas for the new shows?
I think it's also the fact that children have this nearly always that sense of the wonder of animals. They always think that they can talk and they can their own internal lives, and then we sort of lose that somehow.
But children can also be very cruel to animals.
Yes,
you have to see, the number of times I have to kind of politely go up to carers, say, could you stop your children chasing geese with their children, with their babies? They think it's funny, they're videoing it. Again, it's bringing those two things together, isn't it? The animal, the child, the adult.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to. I absolutely, I agree. I mean, I think it's quite complicated question, but I think that sort of intuition we've as a species we've historically had in relation to the natural world could be reinstated for the better, or can be kind of remembered. That sort of the wonder of what surrounds us, and that sort of the mystical relationship that we can have with living in non-living things. Is quite an interesting. That sort of might be generative in some ways.
So in some ways, maybe if you have any kind of mission, I mean, I know that your practice is deliberately not openly didactic, which I like. No one learns anything from having a teacher telling them. We try increasingly to engage our students in experiential learning. It seems to be something that Gen Z in particular want more of, for obvious reasons, I guess. But I guess the ultimate thing would be that you're making some contribution to making people more aware of the beauty of the world around us, but also the way we engage with and negotiate relationships with animals, children, flora and fauna. So one last question: what's the exhibition you haven't yet been able to make that you'd like to make? Or is that a silly question because you're always about, you're not there yet?
I think there are several things around ecology that I'm always thinking about. But I think I'm going to answer with another thing because I'm Ukrainian, and with the current state of affairs in the world, something that I have been thinking about was bringing more Ukrainian artists to institutions in the UK, and having perhaps a focus survey of contemporary Ukrainian art in the UK could be something really interesting.
That'd be a kind of dream exhibition.
I recently did a solo show of Alina Zamanova, who's a Kiev-based artist, and her work is fantastic, and we're going to continue working together, I think. So actually is also in many ways interested in ecology, but kind of during wartime.
I was going to say, what is happening to all of those worlds? We talked about children, particularly their psychology when the bombs are dropping, with hearing about their brothers and sisters being killed and in battle, and animals. What's happening to animals in war? That's something that is no one ever thinks about that. Again, the human being is always at the top of that hierarchy. I think it'd be great. What that would be a great idea. And I just wanted to say actually that obviously I've historically, but also in the present, I have Ukrainian students, Ukrainian artists into London. The tragedy of the choice she had to make about feeling quite guilty about leaving the Ukraine and Kyiv, but having her children, and it reminded me of Barbara Hepworth, who, when the bombs are dropping in World War II in London, she moves her triplets, her 3 little kids, down to St Ives, and creates an art colony there. So much good has come out of that as well. But anyway, food for thought, and I'd just like to thank you very much, Maria. It's been a very different conversation, but I do hope the listeners will enjoy the difference. It's like moving from one material to another, isn't it? One thing to another. And I hope that we haven't upset any of our listeners. Maybe I need to put a warning on this one. But it's something. It's part of life. You've got to, as you say, you've got to face up to these things. You can't just hide them and obscure them. But I'd just like to thank you on behalf of all the listeners for sharing. Very candidly, I think, sharing your ideas. I mean, I've learned an awful lot because I've only ever really been to your shows and never had the chance to actually discuss your ideas with you, and that has been very, very moving and really stimulating for me. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you. Okay.
Pleasure.